And it's the dumbest bill in America. And it is from Delegate Guzman of Prince William County, Virginia. And it criminalizes parents who refuse gender-affirming treatment. Yeah, that's what it does. You won't believe it. Yes, it does. So you are a criminal if you're a mom or a dad, and your child comes home to you and tries to identify, by the way, could be a 13-year-old child, could be an 11-year-old child, doesn't matter. If your child comes home to you and you're the parent and your child says, I want to identify as the opposite gender or no gender at all, you can be criminalized. You can be brought to justice. You can be thrown in jail. This is what Guzman's bill does. So she's a delegate from this county in Virginia called Prince William County, Virginia. And she decided, of course, to bring this bill and file this bill in the Virginia State House of Delegates. And you know what broke loose when she put this bill in, because Virginia has already elected Glenn Youngkin as the governor over this very issue. Like the issue being, hey, mom and dads get to decide what is best for their children. Not the state and not crazy left-wing woke teachers or administrators or school boards who aren't even teaching about the basic subjects, but are trying to convince children that they are something that they are not. And by the way, they're still children, so they're under the full purview of their parents, but that's not what the left believes. That's why Glenn Youngkin won. Well, Guzman did not get the message, Delegate Guzman, so she decided to put this bill in anyway. And we have a clip from Delegate Guzman. You got to listen to this. You won't believe it. Here it is. Listen.
Democratic Virginia Delegate Elizabeth Guzman is a social worker, and she's planning on reintroducing a bill in Richmond that she says would help protect LGBTQ children from their parents and guardians who may not be affirming of their child's sexual orientation and gender identity.
This is how we're going to push back.
Her bill would expand the state's definition of child abuse and neglect to include parents who do not affirm their child's gender identity or sexual orientation.
There's an investigation also in place that is not only, from a social worker, but there's also a police investigation before we make the decision that there's going to be a CPS charge.
What could the penalties be if, the investigation concludes and it's concluded that a parent is not affirming of their LGBTQ child? What could the consequences be?
Well, we first have to have an investigation. It could be a felony, it could be a misdemeanor, but we know that a CPS charge could harm, your employment, could harm your education.
First, we're going to have an investigation. The investigators are going to come to your house and say, Mr. Smith, you are not allowing your 11-year-old boy to wear a bra to school and panties, and therefore we're going to charge you with illegal raising of a child who's really the wrong gender. Or whatever. I don't even know. It's just absurd, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry. This is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And what did you say, Chris, our producer here? What did you say?
Imagine CPS spending their time on that.
It's right, because we have children that they shouldn't be learning math and science and English. Oh no, they should actually be learning how to become a different gender. And the parents are the bad people, so let's just put them all in jail while we can, folks. This individual, this Delegate Guzman, sounds like she's a member of the Stasi, right? She's going to come around and it's like, we're knocking on your door to double check to make sure that you're providing appropriate gender affirming care as we decide in the public school system that you should provide. This is out of control. It's crazy stuff. So get this. In the Epic Times, the Virginia Democrat lawmaker backs down from a legislation that would have made it a crime for parents not to affirm the LGBT child. So this is in the Epic Times. So apparently, the Virginia Democrat state delegate has backed down from her legislation to expand the definition of child abuse to include inflicting physical or mental injury on a child because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. So in other words, she gave that interview on the local news station that you just heard, and there was so much pushback that she decided to, not put the bill in. In her interview with ABC7 on October 13th, State Delegate Elizabeth Guzman, Democrat Prince William, said that under the proposed legislation, parents who don't affirm their children's choice of gender identity could incur child protective services charges that might cause harm to the parent's employment. Guzman noted, so in other words, Guzman in her bill was going to force you to not be able to work as a parent. They were going to take your job away somehow, inform your employer about how bad you were, and help you self-flagellate, and at the same time, maybe even throw you in jail because you were just being, a parent, doing your job. So the House Minority Leader in Virginia in the House of Delegates, his name is Don Scott Jr., he actually said he spoke to Guzman and said, hey, we don't want you to put this bill in right now because, we're right before an election and people might think that we're crazy. Maybe later you could put it in. So he convinced her to not put the bill in because it's unnecessary and it's a distraction to key congressional races in Virginia. So the takeaway from this, ladies and gentlemen, is you have a delegate, a Democrat in Virginia in Prince William County, and she puts a bill in to take away parental rights because you dare to say to your child, I'm sorry, you're a boy, not a girl, or you're a girl, not a boy, and we are not going to allow this. Okay, that's a parent's right. And we're not going to have the school system tell us that you should have gender-affirming care and, take puberty blockers and throwing us into jail because you're 11 years old. And then you have the Virginia House Minority Leader saying, well, we should have this conversation after the election. After, not before the election, after the election, because, people might actually not vote for us. So she, of course, decided to withdraw the actual bill. So in the Babylon Bee, having read this story, they put out this article. Of course, Babylon Bee is a spoof site. Muslim families back on the no-fly list after attending school board meeting. So you can imagine all the students, their parents, of course. And if you don't know anything about Virginia, ladies and gentlemen, I'll tell you that in Northern Virginia, there is an enormous Muslim community. It's very large. It's right outside of the Washington, D.C. area. It's called Northern Virginia, and that area has a large Muslim community. And that community wants nothing to do with this gender identity indoctrination. And so that's what makes this particular Babylon Bee article funny, because it's like, well, the Muslims were initially on the no-fly list. They got off. Now they're back on it because they're going to school board meetings and complaining about this gender analysis picture of all of these people, the women in hijabs and so forth. Sorry, it's funny. It's funny. So podcast listeners, I just want you to hear this interview one more time with Delegate Guzman, just so you know who the Democrat Party really, really is. One more time. Here it is. Here's a clip.
Democratic Virginia Delegate Elizabeth Guzman is a social worker, and she's planning on reintroducing a bill in Richmond that she says would help protect LGBTQ children from their parents and guardians who may not be affirming of their child's sexual orientation and gender identity.
This is how we're going to push back.
Her bill would expand the state's definition of child abuse and neglect to include parents who do not affirm their child's gender identity or sexual orientation.
There's an investigation also in place that is not only, from a social worker, but there's also a police investigation before we make the decision that there's going to be a CPS charge.
What could the penalties be if, the investigation concludes and it's concluded that a parent is not affirming of their LGBTQ child? What could the consequences be?
Well, we first have to have an investigation. It could be a felony, it could be a misdemeanor, but we know that a CPS charge could harm, your employment, could harm your education.
And that is criminalizing parents that refuse gender-affirming treatment. And that's the dumbest bill in America. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.